these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths. We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody. Greatest podcast ever. Give us 5 stars. Our guest today is a repeat offender, Dr. Todd Rose, who's also the co-founder of a think tank called Populace, author of several best-selling books on the psychology of personal achievement. Just released some more insightful research on the trend in self-silencing, which is a social behavior that has profound implications for our culture and politics. You might find yourself frequently holding back your personal views because you fear you may be ostracized or ridiculed. Then you may be falling victim to self-silencing. This is Todd's second time on the podcast. Also appeared in April 2022 to discuss his book on collective illusions. And I want to do a refresher on collective illusions too. So let's explore it. Todd, thanks for being on. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to be back.
So a little bit about you, CEO of Populace. I'm going to ask you what that is real quick. Previously a member of Harvard Graduate School of Education. You founded the Laboratory of Science of Individuality, directed the Mind, Brain, and Education program, also author of best-selling books, Collective Illusions, Dark Horse, and The End of Average. So what is Populace? You're based in Massachusetts. So what do you guys do?
Yeah, so it's actually a new model. We got out of the academy, which I think I sold high on the brand, I think is what I looked like. And we just thought, like, why are we in the university with our lab, my co-founder and I, when we could spin it out and make it its own entity where we can just engage in work on our own terms. And so we fashioned as a new kind of think tank, a private professorship that's just built around our core ideas. And we get to be in the world instead of just in the halls of the academy.
Well, that sounds awesome. How do you pay for it? Is it nonprofit? Take donations?
It's all structured as nonprofit. We've got incredibly generous donors who normally would give money to the university are thinking, why are you spending 40% on overhead when you could just bet on the ideas entrepreneurs? And it's been wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, I find the whole. So it's sort of a think tank, a research tank, if you will. Yep. It's amazing how many of these there are in the DC area all around. And and just as somebody who has to fundraise all the time, I'm always like, how does everybody get, like, there's so many. It's amazing that there's plenty of funding to go around. So I'm glad there is, because it sounds like it's
that's
good
right.
work.
And the thing that I'm really proud of is we're a kind of a weird kind of think tank, which is we are focused on culture first, and then institutions and policy we think is important, but we're not good at policy, but we think everything is downstream from culture in free societies.
It is. I say that all the time. It was Andrew Breitbart who famously said politics is downstream of culture. I always add a third to that, like an in between, because I think it's slightly more complicated than that. It's culture, politics, then policy. I guess he said politics. So I guess I'm not disagreeing with him. I'm just saying, because people talk about policy objectives, and I'm like, just because even if you win the hearts and minds, it doesn't mean you're at the policy objectives yet. You haven't won the politics yet. So it's always, it's culture, it's politics, which means elections, which means majorities, which means legislation, and then you get policy. So like the mission of Populace, though, I mean, you guys got every think tank, research tank focuses on something. You see folks focus on culture. Maybe unpack that a little bit. Yeah,
sure. So like the sort of wonky version is this. I think we're barely scratching the surface about what free societies can accomplish. We really made, you think about from the beginning of the revolution and the application of the ideas of the Enlightenment and of free markets from like Adam Smith. Those were bold ideas about self-governance and free markets, and they've paid off in spades, right? I mean, from an economic standpoint, we've proven you can generate incredible abundance if people cooperate freely rather than controlling from top down. I believe, and the reason Populace exists, is that we can go further, that actually by enabling more bottom-up freedom and greater cooperation and less top-down control, we can get not only economic abundance, but psychological and spiritual abundance. And so we believe we know how to get that done, and we are looking at the mindset, cultural, and institutional conditions that would enable that. So that's what we're all about.
So there are a lot of psychologists and sociologists on your staff. I mean, is that how you come to these conclusions? Are you what is your background?
So I have a really weird background. So I was trained in interdisciplinary neuroscience, psychology, and then applying that to learning and development. And then my background's in complex systems. So basically, we're used to thinking in terms of paradigms, right? I know
Mhm.
that's a kind of wonky, but I think what's going on in America right now is we are not arguing on the margins of things. We are debating fundamental assumptions about our society.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is like, usually we only know how to describe paradigm shifts after they've happened, after the bottom falls out and it gets rebuilt. And I believe we are living in a time when we know enough about not only like what direction we want to go, but how it is you can actually shift paradigms. And so we're like focused on that. And the beginning for us in all of our work is you need to have an accurate understanding of what the American people believe, value, and aspire to. And so that led us incidentally to this work on private opinion research because it turns out no one's telling the truth. And so if we're not telling the truth to each other, it is impossible to have strong cultural norms that reflect our values, to have policies that reflect our values, right? And we end up in the place we're at right now, which is a lot of false polarization, a lot of tribal zero-sum behavior that a lot of people really don't want. And it's being driven by a very, very vocal fringe on both sides.
Yeah, I agree with all that. You said it very scientifically, but it mirrors some things I say. People ask me what frustrates me about politics, and I say we should be having debates, as you say, on the margins. I could use that language. I'll also say we should be having advanced discussions about complex policy matters. We should be having,
Yeah.
at this point it's 2024, we should be having PhD level discussions on the margins, right? Like we gotta
Yeah.
tinker with this much to make this happen, but it's very, like you said, it's very foundational. A meaner way of saying that is I said it's like we're having like fourth grade level national discussions. That's how I
Right.
see it.
And that might be an insult to fourth graders, right?
It might be. Yeah, actually, that's true. When I take questions from kids, I don't go to elementary schools, but like middle schoolers, honestly, often, and high school too, like often have some of the most insightful questions because they're unbiased, right? They haven't been infected by the culture around them yet. And so even if it seems like they have an agenda when they're asking me a question, I can tell they don't. Like I can tell the difference, between an adult who's trying to gotcha question you
Yeah.
versus a kid who's just like, I just want to know. Like I actually just don't know, and they're really asking, and it's so cool to see. But all right, so God, you said something I wanted oh, you said the false polarization. That just caught my ear. Do you mind unpacking that one a little bit?
Yeah. So, when we poll people, even just traditional polling, and ask them, do you think we're more united or divided as a country? And like overwhelmingly, like 80 something percent of people say, obviously we're divided. And of those people, a majority say we're extremely divided. And when
Mhm.
you split it by political affiliation, a majority of both sides think the other side no longer shares their fundamental values for the
Mhm.
country. Okay, well then when we deploy what's called these private opinion methods that are known to be able to get around the distorting effects of social pressure and start to really get under the hood and see what you really believe, it's just shocking. And we're not looking for good news. We're looking for ground truth that we can build
Mhm.
from. But what you see is a surface level sense of polarization that we just really don't agree on basic things, and then under the hood you just see like it's just not true. Like in this case, for example, the this is called the social pressure index. We knew that people felt like they couldn't speak up, right? But we felt like, okay, I know that about myself, but how do I know you feel that? Right? Like
Mhm.
it's hard to know that everyone's feeling this. So we were able to quantify that, like the extent of social pressure in society, and then go further. This is the largest private opinion study ever on the places where people are self-silencing and then outright lying about their
Mhm.
views because they feel like they have to. And we studied the sample sizes over 19,000, which is massive for this kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
we covered 64 of the most controversial issues in the country today. And so let's dig in and we say, okay, well, where are people on this? What are they saying versus what do they private believe? And it's wild. So first of all, 61% of Americans admit that they have self-silenced in the past year, meaning I didn't say something I really wanted to because I thought people would be offended. Okay, that's pretty bad. But when you look under the hood even more, it gets worse, which is across these 64 issues, every single demographic, every one of them, is outright lying in ways that are distorting public opinion on multiple issues. And these things are not like just frivolous topics, right? These are things that affect our culture and that they affect policy. Like I'll give you an example of one that's already happened. Remember the good old fashioned defund the police movement? Like there was a time when we thought a lot of Democrats really, because publicly they were saying they were in favor of that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It turns out it is 3% of Democrats in private actually support it.
Yeah.
Like what would policymakers have done if they realized they were listening to a very, very loud 3%? I don't know that you would have enacted some of the policies of Seattle and other places that clearly were disastrous. Well, we're seeing something else showing up. Like, not only are these sort of false consensus stuff emerging for every demographic, where they say something publicly, they mean the opposite in private. Some of it even bubbles up all the way to us as Americans at large, which is like, for example, closing down the border, like not protecting it. There's a lot of support for that, but absolutely just closing it down. Right now, a majority of Americans publicly say they support closing the border completely.
Is
In
that
private, it's
are
only
they when you ask that question, this complicated policies, it's more complicated than I think people
yeah.
realize. But when you say close the border, does the person you're asking that to, do they understand that we're, or I guess, what do you mean by that question? Is it closing it to regular legal commerce as well? Okay,
Yep. So it's a complete closing of it.
and the person understands that when they're answering the question.
So we use language, and then we'll actually do qualitative and other things like how do people interpret the language, and we gave other statements, particularly around immigration and things like that. But in this case, publicly they say yes, privately they do not believe it. Similarly, I think it's interesting with respect to how people view unions. So publicly, a majority of Americans say unions are good for the economy. Privately, they don't believe it, and
Yeah.
that's true for the poorest Americans.
So funny.
Are outright lying about it. It's a little wild. But the most interesting things is that, like, when you dig down, it's like, okay, so there's all these things that we're not telling the truth about. And when you get to the ground truth, it's unbelievable. Like, not only that we have so much in common, like on 2/3 of all of these controversial issues, the overwhelming majority of all demographic groups are on the same side. And what I think is even more interesting is what we agree on, because it sort of feels like, if you're like me, that I thought we agreed on some basic American values. Like, again, we might argue over sort of a more PhD level, the nuances of it, but I didn't think we were debating fundamental things anymore about like our values. It sort of felt like the wheels fell off over the last few years, and I'm like, oh, maybe everyone just went crazy. But here's the thing, like, for example, all this talk about like socialism. Okay, if we literally directly just ask people about would America be better as a socialist country? So publicly, right, only 16% say yes to that. Privately, it's 7%. 7%, right?
Can we, I know this is nerdy, wonky stuff, but I'm just curious, like, how do you get from the 16 to the 7? What kind of tricks? Okay. What kind of tricks are you using to get people to actually tell the truth?
So you asked for it. So now we get to be nerdy about this. So it's a methodology called the list experiment. It's been around for decades. It's just extremely expensive and time consuming to implement. Here's how you get the private view, because it's really good at stuff that people want to tell you but don't feel like they can. So here's what you do. It works like this. Is why it's so expensive and you need such a big sample size. You build a control group that has, you don't ever ask them just directly with the one statement, like America would be better as a socialist country. Because if you're a Democrat, there's a right answer there. And so what you do is you build like 3 non-sensitive statements, like, recessions are a natural part of an economy. People have opinions, but they don't think they can't tell you. And you give a control group, those 3, you say, how many of those 3 do you agree with? And then you create an experimental group. They get those 3 plus this sensitive one of America would be better off as a socialist country. And then you say, how many of these four do you agree with? And then you can compare those two and you can extract the population level opinion on that. And what's important about this, and it's true of all private opinion methods.
Are you you're almost distracting them with these less controversial questions?
Yeah, because any private opinion methodologies ultimately have to do two things. They have to give you anonymity, right? Mm-hmm. Genuinely, you have to know that no one knows what you're saying. And then plausible deniability. It's really funny. People think like, okay, but if I said, yes, I agree with the statement, someone might burst into the room or come in online and be like, aha, I saw that you said this. So in this case, if you said out of these four, I agree with two, and I came in and said, aha, Congressman agrees with two. It's like, well, you don't know which two I agreed with. And so there's literally no way for us to reverse engineer your individual opinion. And so this methodology has been known to be like one of the best methods for predicting election results, other kinds of things. It's just no one's really done it at scale like this.
Yeah, there's a lot of theories in polling and certainly a popular theory on the right that people lie to pollsters if they're asked about supporting Trump, and which is why you can always assume, and I think this is a pretty commonly held belief by objective observers, you can assume that he's going to outperform polls as a result. Is that maybe this explains why people, but it's weird because it's like when you get a poll, it is anonymous. Nobody, I mean, maybe they ask for names, but a lot of pollsters don't. They ask for identifiers.
They do.
Okay.
So they do. They'll usually build panels, but also people just assume, rightly or wrongly, especially if someone calls you. It's like, I'm from Gallup. And you're like, oh, someone's going to know what I'm saying here. And so we actually got into this private opinion after 2016 for exactly the point you made, which is nobody saw that coming. And we realized, look, at the end of the day, all of the work we want to do requires having an accurate understanding of where Americans are at, and they're not comfortable telling the truth. And it turns out it's not just Trump voters; it's all of us. And that's the bad news. The good news is that since it's us, we can solve it.
I want to ask about another controversial topic that I'm sure it's one of your 64. It has to be, right? Abortion. What are some findings from that? I mean, we talk about that a lot, I bet.
And here's the thing, and I'll say, like, I'm just telling you what people believe, right? Not like, there can be truth to it. So abortion is one of the things that it is. I can tell you right now, the data on this, it's consensus. Like, people are in favor of reasonable right to abortion, right? Which is like the, not last trimester, but like that it should be legal in most cases. And that's not a women's issue. Men and women are very similar. It's a 62% of people. The only demographic group that's not in favor of it is registered Republicans. And again, I'm not taking a moral stance on that. Just this is probably why you're
uncomfortable. That's what I've seen. I mean, in Pew Research, we always, as pro-lifers, we always reference I think it's Pew Research because they do it every year, and they ask more detailed questions than are you pro-abortion or pro-life, because you have to, and you get into the details of first trimester, second trimester, third trimester, and we've always seen numbers between 60 and 70% in favor of banning abortion past 12 weeks. So, which is the case in Europe. That's a normal European policy. It's fairly normal.
That's exactly right. And here's what's really funny. This wasn't in this research, but it's earlier stuff we've done where people's identities in some of these things are tied to the abstraction. I'm pro-life, I'm pro-choice. And they'll see the other side as like bad. And then, but the reality is it leads to just a handful of concrete policies, right? Like behaviors. When you look at those compositions, people are incredibly similar. Like people that call themselves pro-life, what they mean by it is like, life of the mother, incest, rape, certain amounts of time. And then people that are pro-choice will have the exact same composition, but they think that they're on opposite sides of it. So I think this speaks to your call for more substantive conversations about these things rather than just bickering over like the abstract name calling of.
But is there a lot of self-silencing on that issue? Do you notice, or?
There is. It's you'll see it. I'm just looking at the data here. You'll see it move by about upwards of 10 percentage points either way. I'll tell you the group Catholics are actually far more supportive of this position on abortion than they'll say publicly. Because obviously, like from a religious standpoint, that's not the right answer. But what's fascinating is this exact same thing we see play out. I'll tell you one that's sort of near and dear to my heart, because watching these campus protests, I mean, it's one thing to care about innocent people getting killed. It's another thing to be openly supporting terrorists. And I just is like, what in the world happened? I ended up going to Israel like 7 weeks after the attack because you and I talked about collective illusions last time. They recognized that foreign adversaries were using social media to drive anti-Semitic content to generate these collective illusions. So they asked me to come over there and take a look at some things. But what was fascinating, they were so worried about the Harvard Harris poll that had come out that said 60% of Gen Z and 27% of general Americans thought Hamas was justified for their attack. I don't know if you remember this. It was just crazy.
Yeah,
You're like,
I do
justified?
remember it.
Okay, well, let me tell you what those numbers actually are. 1%.
So
1%.
how does that poll get it so wrong? Like what is going on here?
Well, so it's not their fault, right? Because it's Gen Z, so it's 1% for general public, Gen Z is 2%. But think about like what it is. It's a lifestyle choice for them. They don't know the first thing about what's going on. And
They found out what Hamas was like 5 seconds ago.
100%.
Like,
And so, and they're like, hey, they're oppressed, we're oppressed. And so, it's this silly Marxist stuff.
We're oppressed at Harvard. We're oppressed in Harvard.
But quite literally, like, what are you doing? And so it was like they were worried, wait, is this really where young people are? And it turns out, no, it's not. They just believed this is where young people were.
This is
and
where they should
You remember that one video? Yeah, there was that one video in New York of the college student. She's asked, like, so what are you protesting? She said, I don't really know. And she learned to her friends, why are we here? Like, so we've been able to use this to show university presidents, like, it's very different when this is just a fad that people are flocking to. And you almost give it gasoline when you start to be heavy-handed. Do you know what I mean? Where what you really need to do is give them a moral off-ramp. It's okay to worry about innocent people, but when you say, like, I think this reached peak craziness when it's Queers for Palestine. And you're like, but so there's stuff like this around almost everything that matters. The thing I'll tell you that I am the most heartened by is throughout this entire data set, what you'll see when you look at it, when your listeners look at it, is there is this massive return to meritocracy in America. Whether we're talking about college admissions based on merit instead of social factors, how you hire people, how you promote them, how we treat groups that have been disadvantaged in the past, overwhelmingly, like 3 out of 4 Americans on all these issues now privately are in favor of meritocracy. And what I really love about that is they are also in favor of greater diversity. Like, these two things are not different. They're not mad about us wanting a diverse society. They're deeply frustrated by the DEI efforts that would use a completely foreign approach to how we would handle that. And so the way forward on this is not to dance on the grave of DEI, it's to offer better solutions that are consistent with our values.
Yeah. I can see why that would be a heartening finding, but the way you just described it made it sound like it's a trend. So does that, you kind of made it sound like previous data would show that we were moving away from meritocracy, or am I reading that wrong?
So publicly, we have been moving away. And what we're able to show is that's what we're
still
seeing
not what
now
people actually believe.
Yeah, it's not what people believe, and they're increasingly willing to say it, that they've had enough. And similar to like having the government impinge on free speech, like you'll get upwards of a quarter of Americans publicly saying, yeah, I think the government should get involved in misinformation and speech that would be mean to people. It's like 4 or 5% in private. We don't really want this, so we need to stop talking like that.
It sounds like this is a lot of I don't want to make it political, but it does. For me, it does seem like this is a lot of good news for conservatives, because most of these things that people privately believe tend to land on the side of what conservatives want. Now, I don't think a lot of conservatives always explain their position very well, And that gets to like this trend in our national dialogue to speak at a fourth grade level, like I said, and whether that involves demonizing the other side or oversimplifying your position in order to get the clicks that you need from that very, very active, passionate base, which leaves a lot of the population sort of just like wringing their hands, like, what the hell's going on here?
When conservatives were conservatives, if that were still true, this is really good news, right? Because they're conservatives at their best are protecting these fundamental American principles around the dignity and worth of individuals, freedom from tyranny, right, and oppression by the government, and other things, and really making space for personal responsibility and opportunity. And I would say, if that's the lane you want to be in, then I've got good news, right?
Yeah.
This is overwhelmingly popular with the American public across all demographics. And then to that, I would say, when you look at things like immigration, there is an unbelievably clear articulation from the American public. They believe legal immigration is really good for the country, really good. Like, they actually think that legal immigrants add more than they take. There's a lot of, and in the same breath, if you are here illegally, you should be deported. That is an overwhelming majority opinion for Americans. And both of those are true. And yet both sides in the extremes try to bundle them and play them off each other, right? Unless you're for open borders, you must hate immigrants, or like, and so I think we need to get back to this, as you said, like, here's some ground truth about where we're at. Let's have more advanced conversations about the complexities of how we actually get this right.
What's interesting is if there's a trend towards self-silencing, or maybe that's not a trend, maybe that's just normal human psychology forever and ever. I don't know. I don't know if you know, but if it were a trend, there's also another trend ongoing, and it seems to be related to the advent of social media, which is crazier and crazier things are said on social media. More extreme commentators will say crazy and crazier things to get those clicks, which is kind of the opposite of self-silencing. It's like it's literally going the opposite direction. So how do we reconcile these two opposing trends?
Well, so that you've nailed it, and that kind of ties our first conversation on collective illusions to this. So, if just a refresher for the audience, so collective illusions are phenomena where most people in a group end up going along with something that they don't personally agree with because they incorrectly think that most other people in the group agree with it. And so whole societies end up doing things they didn't want to do. And so what you have to know about those collective illusions and how this ties all of it together is two things are, you're right. So first of all, we're always susceptible to self-silencing because as human beings, we have a conformity bias. We prefer to be with our groups, not against our groups. Nothing wrong with that. But here's the tricky part and how it ties to social media. The way your brain estimates what your group thinks, this is no kidding. The loudest voices repeated the most are the majority to your brain. Even if intellectually you know it's not true, your brain. So you put this into social media. Okay, when it was called Twitter, Pew Research had done a big study on it, found 80% of all content is created by 10% of the users. And those 10% are extreme on almost every social issue. So you can see the problem. If 10% of people hold an extreme view, but I think it's 80%, then I'm either going to go against, if I'm not willing to go against my group, then I'm just going to say nothing or I'll lie to go along to get along. And the result are these collective illusions. So that's what we're seeing. And I think that there's no tech solution there. It is just that technology does this to us. And the only way out is to recognize that you can't trust your brain to tell you what your group thinks. So conforming to that is not good for anyone. And we have to double down on these fundamental American principles like tolerance and free expression. If we double down on those norms, we'll be fine. But if we keep going down this direction of tribalism and trying to shut each other up and not having conversations, this isn't going to end well.
I would add doubling down on analytical thinking. I'll tell voters to their face. I'll say, look, don't stop being so easy to lie to. And and I am when I say that, I am describing what you're describing. This tendency to listen to these loud voices and believe that that's just truth. And now I'm usually saying in the context of something like somebody might believe about me, because I have to debunk those narratives. And I'm like, where did you get this information? And where did they get the information? Like, did you see any evidence, or you're just saying something? And what that really boils down to, I don't think it's not about free speech or tolerance. It's just about believing shit online that you have that you should be a little bit more skeptical of, and you're believing it because for some reason you've developed some sort of trust relationship with whoever's saying it, even though that relationship is maybe with an online account. It has a lot of users and they post a lot of things you like, but you literally don't even know the teenager that's in charge of it. You don't know anything about that.
That's actually doing it.
Could be a bot.
You're right. But like, think about it. These two things are related in an important way, right? Which is most of the reason why we won't even think analytically is because the motivation is more to be with our group, to belong, right? So when people get mad at, say, like QAnon or something like that, and they're like, I gave them the evidence. I'm like, yeah, it's not about evidence. That is not what that's about. That is about belonging to something and feeling important. And if you don't, like, nobody gets out of a cult by showing them evidence, right? So I think that, some of the norms that I'm talking about are important because they reduce the sort of pull toward just going along to get along. But even then, we need to get back to teaching people how to think for themselves. And I would argue that our education system has intentionally gutted that kind of thing. We actually are really good at teaching you how to conform. And some of the evidence in our own research here, in terms of self-silencing, people who have a college degree self-silence at significantly higher rates than people who don't. So, like, we're teaching people not to think for themselves and to go along to get along, which is kind of wild.
And the people who, by the way, again, and I do, all my comments are from the political angle, but it's obviously very related because politics is culture and you're studying culture. The people who are most informed in a way, like, and by informed I mean passionate, like they are reading a bunch of stuff. They do, quote, do their own research. They're definitely the most inclined to fall into these traps and just believe stuff. And I'm like, on both sides, and I'm like, but you didn't analyze how you even came to that belief. So, I don't trust this comment of, quote, doing your own research. Because you're missing a lot of context, you're missing a lot of background on that particular policy or that particular issue or that particular news story that we're even talking about. And I don't know how to shake people out of that. Maybe that's a question for you, is because you do all this research, you've come to all these conclusions. Then how do you actually push that mirror up to somebody and help them understand if they're falling into these traps?
Yeah, so the thing is number one, for example, if people care a lot about the group, that's what they're trying to do. We show them that, in fact, conforming to this phantom is destroying the very group you care about. That's incentivizing. But the most important thing, I think, for a critical thinking standpoint, is to use our desire to belong to create norms. What does it mean to belong? Just like at our best as Americans, it means live and let live. Right? Like, if I said, what does it mean to be an American? It's like, look, I'm going to let you live your life as long as you're not hurting someone, right? That's what it means to be part of this. So we've been really obsessed about this with the rise of AI, right? Because if we have a generation of people who think AI is the oracle, then we are in really big trouble. They're like, oh, I got the answer. It told me. And like, no, you're being lied to. And you think it's true. So we've been playing around with, there's some really cool places, like this place called Alpha School in Austin, Texas, that is using AI, but they actually teach kids. They go bug hunting. They get monetary rewards when they find factual flaws in it. So they just get the habit of assuming it's not always true, and it's up to me to decide what it is. And that becomes the culture of the school, then becomes, that. So I think there's some things we can do there. But ultimately, as human beings, we tend to take the path of least resistance. And so without creating good norms and other kinds of incentives, I think it's easy for us all, myself included, to easily think, I've done the research, and now, like, really fall into these traps in ways that aren't very productive.
Yeah, I mean, is there education systems gearing people towards these psychological fallacies? And how do we even change that? I mean, what's the right way to teach? Are there any specific
Well,
examples of what the
oh
way
yeah,
teachers are doing it?
listen, I think that they're just not everything has to be brand new, right? Montessori does a phenomenal job of this. Anything that uses Socratic dialogue as instructions. I'm on the board of Sal Khan, Khan Academy, stuff, his Khan lab schools. One of the first things Sal did, which I think was genius, they started using AI. But instead of having AI ever tell a kid an answer, it actually only engages in Socratic dialogue. It is gonna help you think for yourself, but it will never think for you. So there's things like this that we can do if we're really thinking about what our values are. If we want our kids to be able to think analytically and think for themselves, then we have to build those things into our institutions that incentivize it.
Okay, yeah, so some very simple teaching methods that
Mhm.
just why do we stop using them? Why aren't professors, teachers
Because
using them
that is
anymore?
not the point. Like that is not the point of education. And it hasn't been since Frederick Taylor and scientific management in the 1930s and 40s, where he flat out said, in the past, people were first. In the future, the system has to be first. And we flipped from a bottom up society to a top down society. And instead of people working for, or government working for the people, we work for the government. Like think about school. Like in our data right now, over 80% of all Americans support school choice,
Yeah,
including a supermajority of Democrats.
right.
And
And
yet
yet,
you
and
might
yet,
think by saying that this is some controversial thing that you're trying to destroy public education. It's just we've got the relationship between our institutions and people backwards right now. And so we've had an education system that literally has no feedback loops between parents and the institution. None. Like short of taking your kid out of school, how does a parent's dissatisfaction have any effect on what the system does? It doesn't.
do you have any hope then about the fact that a lot more parents are getting more involved in those school board meetings
Yeah.
over the last few years, and this
Oh,
was because of a
yep.
result of COVID lockdowns and
A
all that,
result of
where
COVID exposed it. Yeah. And so this is what you're seeing. If you look at the changes in policy level at the state level, the number of states that have passed some version of like backpack funding, right? Funding to parents and kids to be able to make some choices, I think is you're seeing the trend. And we saw that priority emerge during COVID and stick around in private opinion. And now it's becoming public. People are frustrated. They want more control, not only of their kids' education, it's a general trend of wanting more control over their own lives. They're sick of being controlled. In our data here, we found overwhelming majority of Americans across all demographics said it's the individual that should have the say in their life, not the expert, just because you think you know more. And I think that end of compliance culture is probably the biggest thing to come out of COVID.
yeah, it's a good thing. I'd love to unpack more of the history that you briefly referenced in the 1930s. It sounds like because that's a very East versus West type of thinking.
Mhm.
In the West, you would have this sort of sense of individualism where this kind of bottom up society versus the top down. Is there a quick way to give us that history lesson on how
You bet.
that origin
You bet.
story that you just explained?
And my publisher is going to love this because I'm going to say I wrote about it extensively in End of Average of how we came to have a standardized society. But the short version is Frederick Taylor was really frustrated with the sort of booms and busts of a bottom up economy. And it was true. We had depressions before the Great Depression. He gets this idea that, wait a minute, like there's only one right way to do anything. And there's really smart people who could figure it out. Why are we letting workers have a say? He invented the concept of manager that didn't exist. He literally said, you're just going to work. And through efficiency, we will produce more and everybody will have more. That was true. It actually did happen. But we removed people's autonomy and their sense that they had some say in what goes on, and we gave them more stuff. And so we've seen that be implemented all over the world. This is a guy, Frederick Taylor, that's affected more people's lives than anybody even realizes. Um, and so what you've got is people saying, you know what, I'm done with this. Just having more stuff is not the point of life. There is a psychological side, a spiritual side. There's a reason. What do you do with all the stuff you have? And that's what people want. They want meaning and purpose in life now, and they know this doesn't give it to them. And so there's this demand for more control. And, you know, power doesn't concede much without pressure, right? Like that's not how that works. So to keep looking to our government to somehow give us back control of our own lives, I think is a fool's errand, right? Like you gotta realize that we are the people and we deserve to have more of a say.
Is that kind of thinking what drove you to leave Harvard? I mean, because
It is.
I was at Harvard. I know how they at least some of those graduate schools, and certainly the one in education, I imagine thinks that way.
It was a little like I will say there's some really wonderful people there, but we were seeing the self-silencing where we'd sit around in these trainings and then would go out and get a beer and be like, that was crazy, right? Like, but it just kept happening. And it's like, I did feel like I had a sort of my own kind of come to Jesus moment where it was like, I was trying to tell people that the way we were doing things isn't okay. And meanwhile, I am literally benefiting from being a professor at Harvard. And there's a hypocrisy there that felt like you couldn't live with that very long. And so that's when my colleague and I decided, you know what? Let's live in truth a little bit and try it a different way. And we spun it out. And it's been fantastic.
What's interesting about the kind of that East versus West distinction is, I don't know if you wrote about this, but it's in my list of questions, so I think you did. In countries like Russia, where they've documented that actually changes occur to spoken language because of the intensity of that repressed thought. That's a pretty wild observation.
It's wild. And so it's to me, it's like once we recognize that we have been living in a top-down version of America for almost 100 years, and it just feels like that's how democracies are supposed to function, but it's not. It's antithetical to the founding principles of our society. And what we're really calling for is a return to basic principles. And if we get that right and we can make that transition without blowing everything up, because right now we are really frustrated. I'll tell you that the most frightening data in our entire study is around resentment and unfairness. So when you get to us, historically, when you get to a place where a majority of people think society is unfair, it is so unstable because people don't care anymore. They'll just burn it down.
Right.
We have, in our private opinion data, 93% of Americans think society is unfair right now.
Oh,
that is terrifying.
That is terrifying because that's what leads to this sort of like unbridled populism, left wing or right wing.
It is just literally burn it down and then give me the scapegoat and I'll go after it. And so you saw that. I mean, the left basically says white people and capitalists, and the far right said it was like elites and immigrants sometimes. And it's like, listen,
it's the establishment, it's whatever that means. Yeah.
Yes. And the thing is that I will say I'm really excited, not to put a plug in this. We're already in the field building this massive new private opinion instrument to get under the hood. What is unfair? What do people mean by unfair and fair? And we're gonna get it at a grain size. And I can't wait to come back and talk to you about this, where we can extract like, here's the things that people genuinely feel are unfair, that there are policy solutions to, right? That we could do tomorrow and get people back into a sense of hope that society is becoming more and more fair. And I think if we don't do that, like it's hard to accomplish anything when you have this much resentment.
Yeah, that 93% is a terrifying number. It doesn't surprise me coming from more liberal thinkers. That's sort of a tenet of liberalism. Like you're always seeing the unfairness in society, and you sort of develop policies accordingly. It's why I'm not a liberal.
Yeah.
But I've absolutely seen that trend on the conservative side, and even so much so that I'm like, look, when I'm looking at primaries and what kind of voters we're looking for, a key question to ask them is, do you believe the system is rigged against you? And if you answer yes to that, then you're probably going to answer yes to that the society is just generally unfair. And you're going to have this burn it down mentality. And there's nothing conservative about the approaches you're going to be taking when you have that mentality. That's why I fully understand what you meant when you say when conservatives were conservatives, because, and I talk about it a lot, like the rise of populism, which to me, I'll define populism very simply. It's telling you what you want to hear instead of the truth. And, because the truth is, if you follow some pretty basic steps in American society, you're going to be successful. That remains, and it's funny because like the same populists on the right will say those things in response to left-wing attacks, but
That's right.
they've sort of adopted the same mentality. And I'm like, you can't.
And that's what happens when it's a zero sum, burn it down, we're all resentful, is it's like, okay, stop cooperating, start fighting, someone's going to lose, it's not going to be us. And it becomes hyper tribal. And the good news is that when it's resentment, you don't have to solve everything all at once. It's from a neuroscience and psychological standpoint, it's just the signal that we're making progress that gives people hope, and they'll lean back into constructive solutions. But right now, a lot of people are profiting from our resentment, right? Yeah. And they're using the populism to tell us what we want to hear and then focus it on their benefit, not ours.
People look for mental shortcuts to explain anything, any negative issue in their lives. People don't want to hear that it's like, God, I mean, we need to talk about it for 3 hours to actually get to the bottom of it because it's really that complicated. Whatever it is, they want to hear that elites have manufactured and been, and basically puppeteered this entire situation, from the closing down of factories to an opioid crisis to now, to illegal immigration. Like, it's all connected by some like dark group. And I'm speaking to our own kind of narratives on the right sometimes. And I'm like, each one of those issues is extremely complicated just by itself. Like, let alone connecting them very, very, very quickly and in this sort of soundbite manner. Like, it's just, take a breath. Take a breath and think about it for a minute. I'd love to get that data from you when you guys unpack it. And I bet I can predict a lot of it. Because I don't think the left and the right have the same ideas of what is fair or unfair. And they're going to have very different answers to that. And I know when I talk to my more conservative voters, and they might say something like the system or this or that. And once I really start talking to them, once you really get some details out of them, their complaints aren't crazy. Their complaints are fairly normal complaints. And my message to them is always, okay, well, there's really nothing I disagree with about what you just said, but I also wouldn't characterize all of those things as generally meaning America is an unfair place that you can no longer thrive in. I'm not sure how you got to that conclusion based on the complaints you have. Like, let's fix those things. Let's fix those things that we agree are problems.
To your point, it's like, if we don't really know what people mean by it, we can't solve it, and they'll continue to be susceptible to the demagoguery and scapegoating. But if you look at just the data we have right now, we start to get some hints, right? Which is, if you just take some of the things that we all agree on, literally every demographic, we agree privately, we also agree publicly. So we know that we all agree. And all those areas of meritocracy. So, for example, affirmative action in college admissions. There isn't a demographic in the country where a majority actually thinks that's how you should admit people. Not one. And yet the public narrative, the media narrative with the end of affirmative action was, this is so unfair. It's like, to whom? Like, who's mad? Like, it was actually the opposite. People overwhelmingly, 3/4 of Americans, including African Americans, are like, no, you should admit people based on merit.
Yeah.
And so if you think about these, or you should hire the best person for the job, like, nah, that's it, right? These are things we all still agree on. And yet the public policies are diametrically opposed to that in the name of fairness. And I believe that it's those policies themselves that have created this sort of widespread, or helped contribute to this widespread sense of like, man, this thing is not fair, right? Like, and so if we can find those things, especially those things that cut across political party and things, and start there, like, what are those 4 or 5 ground truths that we all believe as fair and aren't happening, and give folks like you the ability to say, okay, let's figure out what the policy play is here. I think we can really turn this around, but we've got to get that information, and we'll have that early next year.
Yeah, we can't wait for it. We'll have you back on again, Todd, and appreciate your research, appreciate your work. It's been a fascinating conversation. We'd go longer, but I'm already late for my next thing, unfortunately.
You got a day job, is this what you're saying?
Yeah. Well, this is part of it. Communicating with my constituents, giving them this kind of information is part of my job. That's how I view it, and I love doing it. So, Dr. Todd Rose, thank you so much for being on. This has been awesome.
Thank you.